Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here, and I will talk about some of the secrets of the financial and economic system. Now, talking about economics, the track record of macroeconomics has been quite bad. And recently, not too long ago, in the Journal of Economic Perspectives, some senior professors of economics have admitted that macroeconomics hasn't made any progress in at least a century. Economists today are still trying to figure out what they already tried to figure out 90 years, 100 years ago, namely what determines economic growth in the short term, in the long run, how does fiscal policy work, how does monetary policy work. And sure enough, economists continue to be surprised by events such as the significant inflation we had in late 21 and 22, and recurring banking crises, or things like very high Chinese economic growth in recent decades. Why the inflation surprise? Well, actually, many economists thought that the central bank policies of 2020 were the same as in 2008 when there was a financial crisis, namely quantitative easing, when actually the policies were very different. In 2008 there was no inflation, so they thought it's also going to cause no inflation. And so basically they were wrong. Now when the 2008 crisis hit, economists thought they could comment when the journalists asked them questions. And really, if they'd been honest, they would have said, sorry, we can't give any comment. Why? It's a banking crisis, it's big, markets are down, please comment. Well, sorry, we can't comment, would have been the honest answer. Why? Well, our theories, our models, don't have any banks in them. But of course, they sort of tried to talk their way out. Now, the reality is banks do matter. In the leading textbooks, in monetary economics and the economic theories, they're represented merely as financial intermediaries, gathering deposits, doing their thing, and then lending out money. And so that's actually the justification why they think they can drop them, because an intermediary shouldn't really have a big impact in their own right. But actually, as we saw with the 2008 banking crisis and many other instances, banks do matter. And that really surprised economists, but it also proved that macroeconomics without banks is really wrong. So how do banks actually work? Well, that's been controversial. And a bit more than a decade ago, I actually conducted the first empirical test of how banks really work. And as far as we have records, the first such test in the 5,000-year history of banking. And I did find that the textbook story of how banks are just financial intermediaries is wrong. But before we come to that, another question. Where does money come from? Together with some of my students, I published a book with that title, Where Does Money Come From, more than a decade ago. And when you ask people, the majority gives the answer, well, it's something very important clearly, so it's the government or it's the central bank. And we did this survey of over 1,000 people in Frankfurt, 84% thought that is the answer. But the government doesn't create any money, and the central bank creates only 3%, sometimes a bit more, 4 or 5% of the money supply. Who creates the majority and allocates the majority of the money supply? Well, by now you may have guessed that it has something to do with the banks. Most money comes from the banks. That's how what my empirical tests found. The process is really the opposite of what they tell us. Banks don't gather deposits and lend the money. What really happens in an economic sense is, and also in a legal sense, is the banks create credit and lend, and that creates the deposits. How can banks create money? Because our money supply consists largely of bank deposits. How do they create these deposits? Well, that's actually quite easy at law, and English law is clearest on this. Because bank deposits at law are simply a record of how much money the bank owes us. And so by virtue of the loan contract, banks have an accounts payable liability to us, which is merely represented as another type of liability they call customer deposits. And hey presto, they've created money. Now once you know that banks are allowed to newly invent money, you also understand why banks are so important and powerful, and that it's crucial to have the right type of banking system. For example, in the UK, you've got 5 mega banks, and they just want to do big business, easy business with a small number of very big customers, so they lend billions to hedge funds and private equity funds, and small firms don't get any money. And they mainly, therefore, create credit for purchases of assets, real estate, financial assets. And when you create a lot of money and push it into asset markets, what you get, asset price inflation, and that creates these boom and bust cycles that have been notorious for a long time in the British economy. But if instead you have thousands of small local banks that lend mainly to small local firms for productive business investment, then you have a very decentralized and very egalitarian money creation system that distributes the money fairly equally across the country, and you get growth without inflation, without these asset price bubbles. And you can have very, very high economic growth. Now, economists love to talk about scarcity and about higher taxes, austerity. Now, few people realize we can have abundance for all if you have the right economic system. We can have high, steady, and sustainable economic growth. That's been proven by the East Asian economies that grew 15% annually for decades, starting with Japan, Korea, Taiwan, Singapore, and from the end of the 70s, also China. And they all did this by having a decentralized banking system with banks lending for productive business investment to small firms. And when you have 15% economic growth, which is possible with this system, you double national income every 4.5 years, and that's how China moved from a developing country to developed country status and superpower status within 1-2 generations. And the other countries did equally well. So let's not accept low growth, zero growth, or degrowth. We're told we've got limits to growth. You know, they told us half a century ago we're running out of resources, we can't have growth. And then, of course, in the 70s, when they had these stories, that was the same time when they introduced this inflation. The central banks were encouraged the banks to create credit for consumption, and then you get consumer price inflation. That's really what happened then, stagflation, low real growth, because it wasn't credit creation for business investment, but it was for consumption. But hang on, isn't there some truth in this argument that we have limits to growth? And also, doesn't economic growth hurt the environment? We're told. Well, that's not true. Limits to growth, well, that's also not true. You know why? And I can prove this here and now. There is no growth. Growth doesn't exist. Ask any physicist, and you're studying physics. How's that supposed to work? The laws of thermodynamics tell us you can transform energy, but you can't create it or destroy it. And what about economic growth? Well, that is a statistical fiction, and the statistical fiction itself doesn't hurt the environment. We need to protect the environment with the right actions, and you can have bad actions even at zero and negative growth. So clearly growth is not the enemy of the environment. So where does economic growth come from? Well, we don't have time to go into details. Read my works. For example, a little booklet available in Hungary easily, How to Achieve Long-Term Sustainability, where I reveal that economic growth is invented by the bankers to figure out how to charge highest interest, maximum interest to governments on their national debt, because you want to max out. And that explains why interest rates follow economic growth, and they're positively correlated, and long rates are roughly equal to the economic growth rate. So why was inflation created? The recent one, 21, 22. Well, what happened was the central bank policies were different in 2020 from 2008. I originally proposed quantitative easing in Japan in 1995, and actually there's several QE policies I proposed. QE1 is how to quickly clean up the banking system by the central bank purchasing non-performing assets from banks. But then I realized the banks will be shell-shocked, they still won't lend, so you won't get a recovery, so I proposed QE2 to follow, and that is the central banks purchasing performing assets from non-banks. And that forces the banking system to create money and push it into the economy. Now, QE1 and QE2 were not implemented in Japan. They refused to do it. That's why they had a 20-year recession, sadly. But other central banks listened. So QE1 was implemented in 2008 by the Federal Reserve. And that's why the US economy recovered first, even though the crisis started in America. US banks did very well because their balance sheet got cleaned up by the Federal Reserve, QE1. And they overtook European banks. QE2 was then implemented in 2020. So it's a different policy, QE2. But it was the wrong time. This is a policy for deflation, shrinking economy, collapsing demand. You boost the economy. They did it when the situation was the opposite, 2020. Reasonable demand. You had money supply, credit growing, but you restricted supply through unnecessary government restrictions. And if you do it then, you get inflation. That's what they did. So I warned in 2020, we're going to have significant inflation in 18 months' time, which is what we got. So what do we learn from all this? Well, we learn that we don't need to have low growth. We don't need to have bad policies that don't deliver for people. We also need to be careful about central planners, central bankers, now talking about issuing central bank digital currencies, which will lead to more power for them and a more centralized system, which leads to less growth for us, less prosperity, lower growth, and it looks like that's what they're aiming at. So we need to prevent that. And what we need to do is start up many small banks. And particularly in Hungary and other countries, this seems to be a very good idea because in the past they've been merging banks, the number of banks goes down, that's why economic growth goes down, and of course then also encourage the banks to not lend for productive business, but for asset transactions, not the right policies. Well, in Hungary, we have a bit of concentration of economic resources in Budapest, and jobs are here, young people come here. In the countryside, you have fewer job opportunities, but here in Budapest, it's more expensive. Families, decide not to have children, put things off a little bit because it's more expensive here. If you switch to a decentralized system, create many, many small banks, the whole thing will be reversed. Small firms in the countryside, the provinces, in the far reaches of Hungary will also benefit, create job opportunities. People can stay there, they have bigger houses, and then the government policies to support fertility will be much more fruitful. Well, let's have prosperity and abundance through a decentralized financial system is my proposition. Thank you very much.